Section 1. You're in the parking lot after work, engine off, phone in your hand, staring at a Slack notification that should take 30 seconds to answer. Your jaw is tight, your shoulders are up by your ears, and you can feel yourself getting irritated before you've even opened the message. What if the reason you're snapping isn't that you're too sensitive or bad at stress, but that you've been running on emotional fumes for so long that your brain is treating everything like a threat? Because that's what emotional burnout does. It doesn't always show up as a dramatic collapse. It shows up as a short fuse. It shows up as that moment when a normal request feels like an insult. It shows up as you reading a neutral email and hearing an attitude that isn't there. And the stakes are bigger than one bad mood. If nothing changes, you start leaking your best energy into the wrong places. You bring work irritation into your home. You start avoiding people because you don't trust yourself to be kind. You lose sleep, not because you're working, but because your mind won't stop replaying conversations. And little by little, you start losing self-respect, because you know you're reacting in ways that aren't you. So here's what you're getting today. You're going to learn how to spot the early warning signs of burnout before you hit the wall and do something you regret. You're going to learn how to set small, real limits around your time and availability so your job stops feeling like it has 24-hour access to your mind. And you're going to learn how to rebuild a sense of control over your day so you can respond on purpose instead of reacting on impulse. Educational content inspired by classical Stoic texts. Not medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. If you want steady Stoic focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships every week, this is the channel for you. Stay with me until the very end, and while you're here, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let's get honest about what's really happening when you feel emotionally fried at work. It's not just that you're busy. It's that you're mentally on call all the time. Even when you're off, part of you is still scanning for the next message, the next task, the next thing you might have forgotten. Your body stays in that slightly braced position, like something is about to happen. And when you live there long enough, your emotional reactions get cheaper. You don't have to think your way into anger or frustration, it's already waiting near the surface. You start snapping over things that never used to bother you, and then you feel guilty, because you tell yourself you should be grateful, or tougher, or more professional. But guilt doesn't restore your capacity. It just adds another weight. You might recognize this in small scenes. You're on a Zoom call and someone talks too long, and you feel a rush of irritation like they're stealing your life. You see your calendar stacked and you feel trapped, even if half those meetings aren't truly urgent. A coworker sends a quick question at 4:58 and your whole mood drops, not because the question is hard, but because you feel like your time isn't yours. And then there's the worst part, you start questioning yourself. You think, why can't I handle this? Why am I like this now? Why do I feel so close to the edge? Here's the simple truth, burnout isn't a character flaw. It's a capacity problem. And capacity problems don't respond to shame. They respond to structure. They respond to boundaries. They respond to training your mind to stop treating every interruption as an emergency. The Stoics had a sharp way of looking at this. Epictetus reminds you, in his plain, direct style, that what upsets you isn't the thing itself, but the meaning you attach to it. That doesn't mean your job is harmless. It means your interpretations are either fueling your burnout or easing it. If every message means I'm failing, I'm behind, I'm trapped, then your body reacts like it's fighting for survival. No wonder you're exhausted. But if you can change the meaning, even slightly, you change the emotional load you carry. And I want to be specific, the goal today is not to make you love your job. The goal is to help you stop bleeding emotional energy into every small moment. To help you keep your dignity under pressure. To help you end a workday without feeling like you've been sandpapered down to nothing. Here's the roadmap for where we're going. First, we're going to name the real warning signs of emotional burnout that show up before you crash, the signals most people ignore until it's too late. Next, we'll pull apart one hidden belief that makes you feel like you have to be available all the time, and we'll replace it with a calmer rule you can actually live by. Then, we'll build a practical pause that creates space between a trigger and your response, so you're not sending messages from pure emotion. After that, we'll set 1 or 2 small limits around time and access that protect your evenings without starting a war at work. Finally, we'll bring everything into a real-life pressure moment so you can feel how these tools work when your nerves are already cooked. As we do this, I want you to stop thinking in extremes. You don't need a total life reset to get relief. You don't need to quit tomorrow. You don't need to become some perfectly calm person who never feels annoyed. What you need is a way to notice the buildup and intervene earlier. Earlier is everything. Earlier is how you keep one stressful week from turning into a new personality. And if you're thinking, okay, but my job is legitimately demanding, I'm not here to argue with you. Some jobs are brutal. Some managers are unclear. Some workplaces reward urgency and punish boundaries. But even in those environments, you still have choices about your response window, your internal rules, and the meaning you attach to every ping. That's what we're training. Control where you actually have it, so you stop fighting for control where you don't. In a bit, we're going to come back to a Friday night moment where you're finally trying to shut down for the weekend, and a message lands that would normally pull you right back into the stress. You'll feel the old reaction rise up, and you'll see exactly how one pause and one sentence changes the entire night. Section 2. The first thing you have to change when you're emotionally burned out is this: you stop treating every incoming message as a demand that requires an immediate emotional response. If you don't change this, burnout keeps tightening its grip because your nervous system never gets a real break. Every ping becomes a tiny alarm. Every quick question steals a little more attention. And the longer you live that way, the smaller your fuse gets, until you're snapping over things that used to feel easy. Speed can look like professionalism, but when you're fried, speed becomes self-betrayal. When you answer everything instantly, you quietly tell yourself, my peace is optional. You train your mind to believe other people's urgency automatically outranks your priorities. The stakes are simple: if you keep doing that, you'll keep bleeding emotional energy all day, then you'll come home with nothing left for your life. You'll carry irritability into your relationships, you'll sleep lightly, and you'll start dreading even simple conversations because you don't trust your own mood. And then you'll blame yourself for not handling it, when the real issue is that you're living like a human emergency hotline. Here's why this works, in plain language. Your brain can't settle while it thinks it's on duty. Even if you're sitting still, mentally you're standing at attention, scanning for what might go wrong. Each notification cues a mini stress response, a squeeze in your chest, a tightening in your jaw, a subtle rush that says, respond, fix, and prove. If you obey that cue every time, you reinforce the pattern. You don't just respond quickly, you become quick to react. But when you build a small delay on purpose, you retrain the system. You teach your body, we can see this and not jump. That tiny delay is the start of emotional control, because it creates space between the trigger and your response. This is what a calmer, more focused version of you does. Not someone who doesn't care. Someone who cares enough to protect their capacity. Emotional control isn't about never feeling stressed. It's about noticing the moment your stress is trying to drive the car, and taking the wheel back before you crash into someone with your words or your tone. If you're burned out, you don't need more motivation. You need a better rule for how you engage, so you're not living in permanent reaction mode. Your microscript is short, word for word, and it's designed to interrupt the spike. When a message hits and you feel irritation rise, you say, I can be responsible without being immediate. If you need a second line, add, I'll choose my response window. That's it. No long speeches in your head. No arguing with your feelings. Just those lines, like a switch that moves you from impulse to intention. Now let's make it real. It's Wednesday afternoon. You're in a home office that's really the corner of your living room, or you're at a desk in an open-plan space where you can hear other people's calls. You're already behind in trying to finish something that actually requires focus. Your laptop dings. It's your manager on Slack, need your thoughts ASAP. The old reaction shows up fast. Your stomach drops, your shoulders tense, and you open the chat like you're late for something. You start typing while you're irritated, and your tone gets sharper than you intended. You reread it, you delete a line, you rewrite it, and now you're stuck in that miserable loop where you're half working and half panicking. Try it with the new response. The message hits and your body spikes. You don't fight the spike, and you don't obey it. You keep your hands on your current task for 2 breaths. You say, I can be responsible without being immediate. Then you decide what responsible actually looks like here. Maybe it's a quick acknowledgement that buys you time. You type, got it. I'm finishing this doc, can I circle back in 25 minutes? You hit send, you return to the work in front of you, and you keep your nervous system from sliding into full alarm. When you do respond later, you're calmer, clearer, and you don't have to clean up tone. You didn't ignore your manager. You didn't get passive-aggressive. You simply stopped letting urgency control your body. This isn't about being difficult or playing games. It's about restoring a basic truth: you are allowed to choose when you engage. Even in demanding jobs, most messages are not emergencies. They feel like emergencies because you've been trained to treat them that way. And when you're burned out, everything feels louder. A normal request feels like pressure. A neutral tone sounds like criticism. A late afternoon message feels like a theft of your evening. The delay gives you room to interpret accurately instead of emotionally. It gives you a chance to choose a professional response, not an exhausted reaction. A delay also protects your relationships at work. When you answer instantly while irritated, you leak tone. You think you're being efficient, but you're really broadcasting fatigue. Then you end up cleaning up misunderstandings later, or you build a reputation for being hard to work with, when the real issue is that you're overloaded. A small buffer helps you stay neutral, and neutral buys you options. Neutral lets you ask for clarity. Neutral lets you set expectations. Neutral lets you say no without sounding like you're about to explode. Now for the tiny action, and it has to be measurable. Today, pick 1 hour during your workday and give yourself a mandatory 2-minute buffer before you reply to anything. You can still read messages if you need to, but you do not answer in the first 2 minutes. If something is truly urgent, 2 minutes won't break it. But those 2 minutes will break the reflex that's breaking you. You'll start to feel the difference between a real requirement and a manufactured rush, and that difference is where your control lives. You're not trying to become unreachable. You're trying to become deliberate. Now let's do a slow practice moment together, as if a message just hit. Imagine your phone lighting up with a work notification while you're trying to finish something. Feel the rush in your body. Don't judge it. Take 3 slow breaths with me, in, hold, and out. Again, in, hold, and out. One more time, in, hold, and out. Now say the microscript once, out loud if you can: I can be responsible without being immediate. Say it again, a little slower so your body gets used to it: I can be responsible without being immediate. Notice what changes when you give yourself permission to pause. Your shoulders drop a little. Your jaw unclenches a little. That's not magic. That's your nervous system learning a new rule. One more practical detail, because this is where people slip. When you delay, your mind may start inventing stories. You'll think, they'll be mad, or I'm failing, or I'm going to look bad. When that happens, don't debate the story. Return to the rule: I'll choose my response window. You're not refusing work. You're refusing panic. That distinction matters, because panic makes you sloppy, reactive, and resentful. A response window makes you steady. Hold on to this, because later we'll put it under real pressure, when you're off the clock and a message lands that would normally steal your entire evening. The buffer is what keeps one stressful moment from turning into a full emotional burnout spiral. Section 3. The next shift you need to make when you're emotionally burned out is learning to stop personalizing pressure. If you don't change this, every demand at work feels like a judgment on you as a person, not just a request about a task. And when pressure feels personal, your emotional reactions get sharper, faster, and harder to control. Here's the core claim: not everything that feels directed at you is actually about you. If you miss this, burnout deepens, because you end up carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours. You start defending yourself when no one is attacking. You start over-explaining when no explanation was asked for. You start feeling disrespected when what's really happening is disorganization, urgency, or poor communication upstream. And the cost is real. You waste emotional energy fighting imaginary threats, and you leave work feeling bruised instead of simply tired. This works because your brain is constantly trying to protect your identity. When you're under sustained stress, that protective instinct gets jumpy. A short email reads like criticism. A delayed response feels like rejection. A blunt comment feels like a verdict on your competence. Your body reacts first, before you've had time to interpret accurately. But when you can separate pressure from personal meaning, you lower the emotional charge instantly. You're not denying reality. You're seeing it more clearly. This is how a steadier version of you stays grounded even when work gets messy. The Stoics were precise about this. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself that other people act from their own impressions, habits, and pressures, not from a desire to harm him personally. That idea isn't philosophical fluff. It's a practical filter. When you apply it, you stop absorbing other people's stress as if it were a commentary on your worth. You still do your job. You still take responsibility. You just stop taking everything to heart. Here's the microscript you're going to use when something hits you emotionally. Say it silently, right away: this is about the situation, not my value. If you need a second line, add, I can respond without defending myself. Keep it simple. This isn't a pep talk. It's a reset. Let's walk through a familiar North American work scene. You're in a meeting, virtual or in person. A colleague says, we really need to move faster on this, and glances in your direction. The old reaction is instant. You feel heat in your face. You start replaying everything you've done. You want to explain why things took time, why you were waiting on someone else, why it's not fair. Even if you don't say anything out loud, your body is already tense, and you're half checked out for the rest of the meeting. You leave feeling annoyed and slightly humiliated, and you carry that mood with you. Now try it with the new response. The comment lands. You feel the same initial jolt, because you're human. But instead of spinning, you say to yourself, this is about the situation, not my value. You notice that the project is under pressure. Deadlines are tight. People are stressed. You respond calmly, got it. Let's clarify the next milestone so we can move it forward. You didn't defend. You didn't collapse. You didn't absorb shame. You stayed oriented to the work, not your ego. And because of that, the emotional spike passes much faster. You leave the meeting with energy left, not resentment. This distinction matters even more when you're burned out, because burnout makes everything feel personal. When your reserves are low, you don't have the buffer to interpret generously. You're already tired, so your mind fills in the gaps with threat. You think, they don't respect me, or I'm failing, or I'm about to be exposed. But most of the time, pressure at work is structural, not personal. It comes from deadlines, incentives, unclear roles, or someone else's stress rolling downhill. You don't need to carry all of that inside your chest. Here's the tiny action for today. Pick one recurring situation where you reliably feel defensive. It might be a certain person's tone, a type of meeting, or feedback emails. Before the next time it happens, write the microscript somewhere you'll see it. A sticky note. A notes app. A margin of your planner. Then, when the moment comes, your only job is to notice the reaction and repeat the line once: this is about the situation, not my value. That's it. You're not trying to fix the system today. You're training your interpretation. Now let's slow it down with a brief practice, because this works better when your body learns it, not just your mind. Think of a recent moment at work where you felt criticized or overlooked. You don't need to relive the whole thing. Just bring the image to mind. Notice where you feel it in your body. Maybe it's a tight chest. Maybe it's a knot in your stomach. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold for a beat. Let it out slowly through your mouth. As you exhale, say the sentence quietly in your head, "This is about the situation, not my value." Take another breath. Say it again, a little slower. Feel the difference between defending yourself and simply staying present. This isn't about becoming passive. It's about choosing when to engage emotionally. When you stop personalizing pressure, you gain leverage. You can ask clearer questions. You can set boundaries without heat. You can push back when needed, but from a steady place instead of a wounded one. And that steadiness protects you from burnout, because you're no longer fighting invisible battles all day. There's another subtle benefit here. When you don't personalize everything, you stop narrating your entire workday as a story about you. You stop thinking, "I'm behind, I'm failing, and I'm not enough." Instead, you see tasks, constraints, and trade-offs. That shift alone can lower your emotional load dramatically. You still care, but you're not entangled. If you notice yourself slipping into old habits, don't scold yourself. Burnout patterns don't disappear overnight. Each time you catch the reaction and apply the script, you're weakening the old reflex. You're building a gap between stimulus and story. And that gap is where your control lives. Keep this tool close. We're going to combine it later with the response buffer from earlier, and you'll see how not personalizing pressure makes it much easier to delay responses without spiraling. When you can pause and interpret accurately, pressure loses its bite, and emotional burnout stops running the show. Section 4. The next thing that quietly fuels emotional burnout is the belief that you must always be available to prove you're reliable. If you don't challenge this, work slowly expands into every open space of your life. Even when you're not actively working, part of you is braced, waiting to be needed. And that constant partial attention drains you faster than long hours ever could. Here's the claim you need to hear clearly: availability is not the same thing as commitment. If you confuse the two, you'll keep giving access where structure is what's actually required. The stakes are high. When you're always available, you never fully rest. When you never fully rest, your tolerance drops. When your tolerance drops, small requests feel like personal intrusions. That's how burnout turns into bitterness, and bitterness turns into emotional withdrawal or sharp reactions you later regret. This works because your brain needs clear on and off signals. Without them, it stays in a low-grade alert state. Think about it like this: if a room light flickers all night, you never get deep sleep. That's what constant availability does to your nervous system. You might not be responding every minute, but the possibility that you could be needed keeps you mentally on. A calmer, more focused version of you understands that limits don't reduce your value. They protect your capacity to actually show up well when it matters. Seneca touches on this idea when he writes about how people who scatter their time end up feeling as though life is slipping through their fingers. He wasn't talking about email, but the principle fits perfectly. When your time has no edges, it doesn't feel generous. It feels stolen. And when time feels stolen, resentment grows quietly in the background of your day. Your microscript for this section is practical and externally usable. When someone reaches out outside your chosen window, the sentence is, "I'm offline right now, but I'll follow up tomorrow." If you need a softer version, use, "I'm stepping away for the evening, I'll pick this up in the morning." Notice what's missing. There's no apology. No over-explaining. No justification. Just clarity. Now let's ground this in a real scene. It's early evening. You're home, maybe cooking, maybe sitting on the couch trying to decompress. Your phone buzzes with a work email or message. It's not an emergency, but it's related to something ongoing. The old reaction shows up immediately. You think, "I should just handle this so it's not hanging over me." You open the message. You start thinking. 10 minutes later, your mind is back at work, your body is tense again, and the evening never really starts. Even if you close the app, the stress lingers. Now replay it with a boundary. The message arrives. You feel the urge to respond. Instead of acting on it, you pause. You remind yourself that availability is not commitment. You send the microscript, "I'm offline right now, but I'll follow up tomorrow." Then you put the phone down. At first, there's discomfort. Your mind wants to check. It wants reassurance. But after a few minutes, something important happens. Your nervous system starts to settle because it finally got a clear signal. This time is protected. The evening becomes yours again, not perfectly, but noticeably. This is where many people get stuck. They worry that setting limits will damage their reputation or relationships. But in most North American work environments, clarity actually builds trust. When people know when to expect you, they stop guessing. When you respond consistently within defined windows, you look dependable, not distant. What erodes trust isn't boundaries. It's unpredictability caused by exhaustion. Snappy replies. Delayed follow-ups because you're overwhelmed. Emotional tone leaks that signal you're stretched too thin. Burnout convinces you that the only two options are total availability or total disengagement. That's a false choice. There's a middle ground where you're present during defined times and fully off during others. That middle ground is where emotional recovery happens. Without it, you're always half working and half living, which means you're never fully doing either. Here's your tiny action for today, and it has to be concrete. Choose one boundary around time and write it down as a rule. Not a goal. A rule. For example, after 7 p.m., I don't respond to work messages unless it's explicitly urgent. Or, I don't check work email during dinner. Pick one. Then decide in advance what sentence you'll use when that boundary is tested. That's it. You're not changing your whole schedule. You're installing one fence. Now let's slow it down with a short practice. Imagine the moment tonight when you'd normally check one last time. Picture your hand reaching for your phone. Pause there. Take a slow breath in. Hold it briefly. Let it out slowly. As you exhale, say to yourself, "Rest is part of doing my job well." Say it again, quieter. Feel how different that is from "I should just push through." You're not being lazy. You're being strategic. There will be resistance, both internal and external. Internally, guilt will show up. You'll think you're being selfish or slacking. Externally, someone might test the boundary, even unintentionally. That doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. It means it's new. Boundaries feel uncomfortable before they feel normal. The discomfort isn't a sign you should give up. It's a sign you're changing a pattern that's been draining you. Another important detail, boundaries work best when they're boring. No drama. No big announcements. No emotional speeches. Just consistent behavior and clear language. When you explain too much, you invite negotiation. When you stay simple, you teach people how to interact with you. Over time, most people adjust, because humans adapt quickly to clear expectations. This also changes how you feel about your work. When your time has edges, work feels contained. It doesn't leak into everything. You stop dreading messages because you know when you'll deal with them. You stop feeling hunted by notifications. That alone can lower emotional burnout significantly because your body finally learns when it can stand down. If you slip, notice it without judgment. Burnout makes habits sticky. One missed boundary doesn't erase the progress. Each time you choose structure over availability, you're reinforcing a new identity, someone who values focus, recovery, and steady contribution over constant reactivity. Hold on to this idea. We're going to combine it later with not personalizing pressure and delaying responses, and you'll see how these three together create something powerful, a workday that ends when it's supposed to, and an emotional state that doesn't feel hijacked by every request. That's how you survive burnout without blowing up your job. Section 5. Another pattern that quietly intensifies emotional burnout is the habit of explaining yourself too much. When you're exhausted, over-explaining feels like protection. You think if people understand your reasoning, your workload, your constraints, then the pressure will ease. But if you don't change this, you end up doing emotional labor on top of your actual work, and that drains you even faster. Here's the claim for this section: the more burned out you are, the more tempting it is to over-justify yourself, and the less helpful that becomes. If you don't interrupt this pattern, every boundary turns into a debate, every request turns into a performance, and you walk away from conversations feeling depleted and vaguely ashamed, even when you didn't do anything wrong. The stakes are subtle but serious. Over time, you teach others that your limits are negotiable, and you teach yourself that your no isn't enough unless it comes with a full defense. This works the way it does because burnout erodes your confidence in your own decisions. When your energy is low, your mind looks for approval to compensate. You want reassurance that you're not being unreasonable, lazy, or difficult. So you add context. You add apologies. You add backstory. And in doing so, you hand over control of the interaction. A steadier version of you understands something important: clarity doesn't require justification. You're allowed to state a limit without making a case for it. The Stoics were blunt about this. Epictetus emphasizes that once you decide what's appropriate, you don't need external validation to carry it out. Translating that into modern life, it means you don't owe everyone a full explanation of your internal process. Especially at work, most people aren't asking for your reasoning. They're asking for an outcome. When you give them a long explanation, you increase emotional exposure without increasing effectiveness. Here's the microscript you'll use to stop over-explaining. It's intentionally short: that won't work for me right now. If you need a follow-up, add, here's what I can do instead. Notice what's missing again. No apology. No excuse. No detailed narrative. Just a boundary and an alternative, if appropriate. Let's put this into a concrete North American scenario. A coworker asks if you can take on an extra task with a tight turnaround. The old reaction kicks in immediately. You feel pressured, guilty, and worried about how you'll be perceived. You start typing a long message explaining everything you already have on your plate: how busy the week has been, how you stayed late yesterday, how you're trying your best. By the time you finish, you feel exposed and slightly resentful. And the worst part? The other person might still push back, because you framed your limit as a plea instead of a statement. Now try it with the new response. The request comes in. You feel the familiar tightening. Instead of launching into explanation, you pause. You say to yourself, I don't need to justify my capacity. Then you reply, that won't work for me right now. I can look at it next week. That's it. The tone is neutral. The boundary is clear. You didn't apologize for existing. And because you didn't turn it into a story, there's less for the other person to argue with. Even if they're disappointed, you walk away with your energy intact. Over-explaining often shows up in meetings too. Someone questions a decision you made, and you feel the urge to walk everyone through your entire thought process to prove you're competent. But competence doesn't come from volume. It comes from clarity. When you calmly state your reasoning once and stop, you project steadiness. When you keep talking because you're anxious, you signal uncertainty, even if your decision was sound. Burnout makes you forget this. When you're emotionally drained, silence feels dangerous. You think you need to fill it. But silence is often your ally. Silence lets your words land. Silence lets others process. Silence keeps you from digging an emotional hole you then have to climb out of. Here's your tiny action for today. Choose one interaction, just one, where you will intentionally respond with fewer words than usual. Set a personal rule: no more than 2 sentences. That's all. You can prepare the sentences in advance if it helps. When the moment comes, deliver them and stop. Don't add a third sentence to soften it. Don't explain unless you're directly asked, and even then, keep it brief. This isn't about being cold. It's about conserving energy. Now let's slow this down with a practice, because over-explaining is as much a body habit as a mental one. Bring to mind a recent moment where you felt compelled to justify yourself. Notice what happens in your body. Maybe there's a flutter in your chest or a tightness in your throat. Take a slow breath in. Hold it gently. Let it out slowly. As you exhale, say quietly, "A clear boundary is enough." Take another breath. Say it again, slower, "A clear boundary is enough." Feel how your body responds to the idea that you don't have to earn permission to protect your time. It's normal to feel awkward the first few times you do this. You might worry you're being rude or unhelpful. That discomfort is a withdrawal symptom from overresponsibility. You've been carrying more emotional weight than your role actually requires. When you set it down, your system protests briefly. Then it adjusts. And once it adjusts, you'll notice something important. People often respect you more, not less. They know where you stand. They know what to expect. And you stop resenting them for pressures you never clearly pushed back on. This also changes how you talk to yourself. When you stop over-explaining to others, you stop over-explaining internally. You don't spend as much time rehearsing arguments in your head. You don't relive conversations trying to justify yourself after the fact. That mental quiet is a huge relief when you're burned out. It frees up space for actual rest, not just physical but emotional. Over-explaining is exhausting because it turns every interaction into a test of your worth. Short, clear responses turn interactions back into what they're supposed to be, coordination around tasks. When you do this consistently, your workday feels lighter, even if the workload doesn't change. You're not carrying unnecessary emotional narratives on top of it. Keep this tool close. We're going to layer it with time boundaries and response delays, and you'll see how not justifying yourself makes those boundaries much easier to hold. When you can say less without guilt, you protect your energy and your self-respect at the same time. That's a critical step in surviving emotional burnout without hardening or shutting down. Section 6. Another habit that keeps emotional burnout alive is trying to mentally solve everything all the time. Even when you're not actively working, your mind keeps running scenarios, replaying conversations, and planning responses. If you don't interrupt this, work follows you everywhere. You might leave the office or shut the laptop, but your thoughts stay clocked in, and that constant mental engagement prevents real recovery. Here's the claim for this section: burnout deepens when you let unfinished work live rent-free in your head. If this pattern doesn't change, rest never actually feels like rest. Even quiet moments feel crowded. You lie down, but your mind keeps scanning. You're with people you care about, but part of you is rehearsing what you'll say tomorrow. And the cost shows up fast. Your sleep gets lighter. Your patience gets thinner. Your emotional reactions get bigger, not because today is worse, but because you never fully reset from yesterday. This works because your brain is designed to seek closure. Open loops feel uncomfortable, so your mind keeps poking at them, hoping to resolve them internally. But most work problems can't be solved in your head at night. They require time, information, or action later. When you keep thinking anyway, you burn energy without making progress. A calmer, more focused version of you understands a key distinction: thinking is only useful when it leads to action. Outside that window, it's just mental noise. The Stoics understood this clearly. Seneca warns against rehearsing troubles in advance, because doing so makes you suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality. In modern terms, that's what rumination does. It convinces you that you're being responsible by thinking, when in fact you're just exhausting yourself emotionally. Letting go isn't negligence. It's choosing the right time to engage. Here's the microscript you'll use when your mind starts looping outside work hours: "I've captured this. I'll handle it tomorrow." If you need a second line, add, "Right now is for rest." Keep it simple and final. This isn't a negotiation with your thoughts. It's a statement. Let's make this concrete. It's late evening. You're in bed or on the couch, trying to wind down. Suddenly you remember a task you didn't finish or a message you still need to send. The old reaction hits instantly. Your heart rate bumps up. You grab your phone just to check one thing. 10 minutes later, You're deep in email or mentally drafting responses. Even if you don't send anything, your body is alert again, and sleep feels farther away. Now replay it with a different response. The thought appears. You don't suppress it. You acknowledge it. Then you take 30 seconds to write it down, on paper, in a notes app, anywhere reliable. Once it's captured, you say the microscript, "I've captured this. I'll handle it tomorrow." Then you stop engaging. At first, your mind will try to pull you back. That's normal. Each time it does, you repeat the line and return your attention to what you're doing. You're teaching your brain a new rule: we don't have to solve this now to be safe. This matters because burnout isn't just about what you do during work hours. It's about whether you ever fully disengage. Without disengagement, your stress hormones stay elevated. You might not feel panicked, but you feel wired and tired at the same time. That state makes emotional control much harder the next day. Small things feel overwhelming because you never gave your system a real break. There's also an emotional cost. When you're constantly thinking about work, it crowds out other parts of your identity. You start feeling like you are your job, instead of someone who has a job. That's dangerous territory, especially when work is stressful. Detaching mentally doesn't mean you care less. It means you refuse to let one domain consume your entire inner life. Here's your tiny action for today, and it needs to be specific. Create a mental shutdown ritual that takes no more than 5 minutes. At the end of your workday, write down the top 3 things you'll handle next. Just 3. Then close the notebook or app and say, out loud if you can, "Work is parked." That phrase matters. It marks a transition. You're not pretending the tasks don't exist. You're placing them somewhere safe so your mind doesn't have to keep holding them. Now let's slow this down with a practice you can use anytime your thoughts start racing. Wherever you are, take a slow breath in. Hold it briefly. Let it out longer than you breathed in. Do that again. As you exhale, say quietly, "Not now." Take another breath. Say, "Tomorrow has its own time." Notice how this shifts your body. Your thoughts might still be there, but they're less gripping. That's enough. You're not trying to erase them. You're changing your relationship to them. One common fear here is, if I let go, I'll forget something important. That fear keeps people mentally tethered to work. But the truth is, writing things down is more reliable than worrying about them. Worry feels productive, but it isn't. Capture is productive. Rumination is not. Once your brain trusts that you have a system, it relaxes. Over time, the urge to keep checking fades, because it's no longer necessary. Another subtle benefit of this practice is emotional space. When your mind isn't full of unfinished business, you become more present. Conversations feel lighter. Evenings feel longer. You notice that you're less irritable, not because your life changed, but because your nervous system finally got a chance to stand down. That makes it much easier to use the other tools we've covered: delayed responses, not personalizing pressure, setting boundaries, and saying less without guilt. If you slip and find yourself spiraling anyway, don't turn it into another problem. Burnout recovery isn't linear. Each time you notice the loop and gently step out of it, you're reinforcing a new habit. You're proving to yourself that you can disengage without things falling apart. Keep this tool in mind. Later, when we move into a high-pressure moment, you'll see how capturing tasks and mentally clocking out protects your emotional bandwidth. It's one of the simplest ways to stop work from owning your inner world, and one of the most powerful steps toward surviving emotional burnout with your calm and self-respect intact. Section 7. Another force that quietly drives emotional burnout is the belief that you must keep pushing even when your internal warning lights are already on. You notice the signs: tight chest, shallow breathing, irritability, mental fog, but you override them because stopping feels irresponsible. If you don't change this, burnout stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something you cooperate with, day after day. Here's the claim for this section: ignoring your early emotional signals doesn't make you stronger, it makes you brittle. And when you're brittle, small pressures cause outsized reactions. The stakes are real. When you keep pushing past your internal limits, you don't just get tired. You lose flexibility. You lose perspective. You lose the ability to choose how you respond. Eventually, something small becomes the breaking point, and you're left wondering why you overreacted when the real issue was weeks of unacknowledged strain. This works the way it does because your body detects overload before your mind does. Emotional burnout isn't a sudden event, it's a slow accumulation. Your nervous system sends signals long before you consciously label them as burnout. But many adults, especially in work cultures that reward endurance, have learned to treat those signals as noise. You tell yourself to push through, to be grateful, to handle it. A steadier version of you does something different. That version treats internal signals as data, not as weakness. Data tells you when to slow down so you don't lose control later. The Stoics were surprisingly practical about this. Marcus Aurelius writes about tending to the ruling part of the mind, which includes noticing when it's strained. He didn't advocate ignoring limits, he advocated maintaining function. In modern terms, that means catching overload early enough that you don't damage your ability to respond with reason. Self-command isn't about suppression. It's about calibration. Here's the microscript for this section, and it's meant to be used internally, in the moment you feel yourself tightening. The sentence is, "This is a signal, not an order." If you need a second line, add, "I can slow down without quitting." These words matter because burnout convinces you that every signal means you're failing or falling behind. This script reframes the signal as information, not a demand. Let's put this into a familiar scene. It's mid-afternoon. You've been working non-stop, bouncing between tasks, messages, and meetings. You notice you're rereading the same sentence on your screen for the third time. Your jaw is clenched. Someone pings you with another request, and irritation flashes hot and fast. The old reaction is to power through. You ignore the signals, answer sharply, and keep going. An hour later, you're exhausted, unfocused, and annoyed at everything, including yourself. Now try it with the new approach. You notice the same signs: mental fog, tension, irritability. Instead of pushing harder, you pause for 10 seconds. You say to yourself, "This is a signal, not an order." You don't quit the day. You don't disappear. You simply adjust. Maybe you stand up and stretch. Maybe you take 3 slow breaths. Maybe you switch to a lower stakes task for 15 minutes. That small intervention interrupts the buildup. You don't become perfectly calm, but you stay functional. And because you didn't ignore the signal, the emotional spike doesn't compound. This matters because burnout thrives on delay. The longer you ignore your signals, the louder they have to get to be noticed. What starts as fatigue turns into irritability. Irritability turns into snapping. Snapping turns into guilt. And guilt drains even more energy. Recognizing signals early short-circuits that cycle. You're not indulging yourself. You're maintaining your capacity to respond well. Many people resist this because they equate slowing down with laziness. But slowing down strategically is how you preserve quality. When you keep pushing while dysregulated, your work suffers anyway. You make mistakes. You misread tone. You send messages you later wish you'd worded differently. Taking a brief pause isn't avoidance, it's maintenance. Just like you wouldn't drive a car with warning lights flashing and expect it to perform better, you shouldn't expect your emotional system to improve under constant strain. Here's your tiny action for today. Set one personal rule tied to a physical or emotional signal. For example, when I notice jaw tension, I pause for 3 breaths. Or, when I reread the same thing twice, I stand up and reset for 2 minutes. Pick one signal and one response. That's it. You're not trying to listen to everything. You're training awareness around one reliable indicator. Now let's do a slow practice together, because this only works if your body experiences it. Wherever you are, take a moment to scan yourself. Notice your shoulders, your jaw, your breath. Without changing anything yet, just notice. Now take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it gently. Let it out slowly through your mouth. As you exhale, say quietly, "This is a signal, not an order." Take another breath. Say it again, slower. Feel how that shifts your relationship to the sensation. The signal didn't disappear, but it lost authority. That's the point. Another layer here is permission. Burnout often comes from believing you're not allowed to respond to your own needs. You think you have to earn rest by collapsing. But waiting until collapse is the least efficient way to recover. Responding to early signals keeps you out of crisis mode. It lets you stay steady instead of swinging between overdrive and shutdown. You might worry that if you start listening to signals, you'll stop getting things done. In practice, the opposite happens. When you intervene early, your focus returns faster. You don't waste energy fighting your own state. You stop turning every task into a test of endurance. Over time, you become more consistent, not less. Consistency is what most workplaces actually value, even if they talk about hustle. This practice also protects your relationships. When you catch overload early, you're less likely to snap at coworkers, partners, or family members. You don't unload the day on the first person who talks to you. That alone can change how evenings feel. You arrive less raw. You recover faster. You keep your emotional spillover contained. If you miss a signal and react anyway, don't spiral into self-criticism. That just adds another layer of strain. Notice it after the fact and adjust next time. Burnout recovery is built from repetition, not perfection. Each time you treat a signal as information instead of an enemy, you strengthen emotional control. Keep this tool close as we move forward. We're going to combine signal awareness with boundaries, mental shutdown, and response delays. Together, they create a system where you don't need willpower to stay calm. Your environment and habits do the work for you. That's how you survive emotional burnout without hardening, numbing out, or losing the version of yourself you actually respect. Section 8. Another habit that quietly pushes emotional burnout from manageable to overwhelming is carrying unfinished emotional reactions forward instead of closing them out. You might handle a situation on the surface, send the message, finish the meeting, meet the deadline, but emotionally, you never finish it. If you don't change this, yesterday's stress keeps sneaking into today, and today's stress piles on top of it. That's how burnout starts to feel permanent instead of situational. Here's the core claim: emotional burnout intensifies when you don't consciously complete emotional moments. If this pattern continues, nothing ever really ends. Conversations linger in your head. Frustrations stay open. Even when a problem is technically solved, your body still acts like it's ongoing. The stakes are serious. When emotions don't get closure, they leak into unrelated moments. You snap at the wrong person. You feel heavy for no clear reason. You lose patience faster because you're carrying more than just the present moment. This works because your nervous system tracks experiences differently than your calendar does. From the brain's perspective, an event isn't over just because the meeting ended or the email was sent. It's over when your body has registered completion. Without that signal, stress stays active in the background. A calmer, more focused version of you understands this and intentionally closes emotional loops, the same way you close tasks. You don't just move on mentally. You mark the moment as done. The Stoics were attentive to this idea of completion. Marcus Aurelius reflects on doing what's required in the present moment and then releasing it. He didn't advocate replaying or ruminating. He emphasized finishing each act cleanly and moving forward unburdened. Applied today, that means not dragging the emotional residue of work through the rest of your day. Here's the microscript for this section, and it's designed to signal closure to your body. After a stressful interaction, say, "That moment is complete." If you need a second line, add, "I'm allowed to let it end." These sentences aren't about denial. They're about marking an ending. Let's put this into a real, familiar scene. You have a tense conversation with a coworker or manager. It doesn't explode, but it's uncomfortable. You stay professional. You say what needs to be said. On paper, you handled it well. But afterward, the conversation keeps replaying in your mind. You think about what you should have said differently. You imagine future fallout. Even hours later, your body feels keyed up. You're distracted during dinner. You're short with people you care about. The moment is over, but emotionally, you're still in it. Now try it with intentional closure. After the conversation ends, you take 30 seconds alone. You breathe slowly once or twice. You say, quietly or internally, that moment is complete. You picture the interaction ending, like a door closing. You're not suppressing feelings. You're acknowledging that whatever happened has happened. You did what you could with the information you had. Then you shift your attention to the next concrete task or environment. It feels subtle, but something important changes. Your body gets the signal that it's safe to stand down. This matters because burnout feeds on carryover. One difficult interaction is manageable. 5 difficult interactions, all mentally replayed and emotionally unresolved, are not. Without closure, your stress compounds. With closure, stress stays contained. You're not pretending work is easy. You're refusing to let it metastasize. This also applies to unfinished frustration. Maybe you had to comply with a decision you disagreed with. Maybe you bit your tongue in a meeting. Maybe you handled something unfairly without pushing back because it wasn't the right moment. If you don't close those moments emotionally, they turn into simmering resentment. That resentment shows up later as irritability or disengagement. Closing the loop doesn't mean approving of what happened. It means acknowledging it's over for now. Here's your tiny action for today. Choose one transition point in your day, end of a meeting, end of a shift, end of a commute, and attach a closure ritual to it. It can be as simple as standing up, stretching once, and saying that part of the day is complete. Or closing your laptop and taking one slow breath before moving on. The key is consistency. You're teaching your nervous system how to switch chapters without dragging the last page forward. Now let's slow this down with a practice you can do immediately. Think of a recent work moment that still feels slightly unresolved emotionally. Don't dive into the details. Just name it. Notice how your body reacts. Take a slow breath in. Hold it gently. Let it out slowly. As you exhale, say, that moment is complete. Take another breath. Say it again, a little slower, I'm allowed to let it end. Notice the shift. The memory may still exist, but it has less charge. That's closure starting to happen. One reason people resist this practice is fear. They think that if they let go emotionally, they'll stop caring or lose motivation. But caring doesn't require constant emotional activation. In fact, chronic activation erodes care over time. Closure preserves care by preventing overload. It lets you show up tomorrow without dragging yesterday's weight into the room. This practice also pairs powerfully with boundaries and mental shutdown. When you end the day without closing emotional loops, your mind keeps reopening them at night. When you intentionally close moments as they happen, your mental shutdown becomes easier. Your evenings feel lighter because there's less unresolved material demanding attention. Another subtle benefit is self-respect. When you mark moments as complete, you're acknowledging your effort. You're saying, I showed up, I handled what I could, and I don't need to punish myself by replaying it endlessly. That shift alone can reduce the shame and self-criticism that often accompany burnout. If you forget to do this in the moment, you can still close loops later. Before bed, you can review the day briefly and say, these moments are done. You don't analyze. You don't fix. You simply mark completion. Over time, your nervous system learns that not every emotional spike needs to be carried forward. This doesn't mean you never revisit issues. It means you revisit them intentionally, during work hours, when action is possible. Outside that window, you let them rest. That separation is essential for emotional recovery. Without it, your system never fully powers down. As we move toward the final application story, hold on to this idea of completion. You'll see how closing emotional loops combines with response delays, boundaries, and signal awareness to stop one stressful moment from contaminating the rest of your day. Emotional burnout thrives on unfinished business. Emotional control thrives on clean endings. Section 9. It's Friday evening, the kind where your body already knows the week is over even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. You shut your laptop, stretch your back, and feel that familiar mix of relief and exhaustion. You've been holding it together all week. You're thinking about dinner, about finally watching something that doesn't involve a screen full of emails, about letting your nervous system come down a notch. Then your phone buzzes. It's a work message. Not marked urgent. Not catastrophic. Just enough to hook you. You feel the reaction instantly. Your chest tightens. Your jaw sets. A hot, irritated thought flashes through your mind. Here we go again. The old pattern starts to spin up. You think about responding immediately just to get it out of the way. You think about how unfair it feels that work keeps bleeding into your personal time. You feel the familiar urge to handle it now so it doesn't hang over your weekend. This is the exact kind of moment that used to derail your nights. You pick up the phone, and before opening the message, you pause. Not because you're perfectly calm, but because you've practiced this. You notice the tension in your shoulders. You recognize it as a signal, not an order. You take one slow breath in, hold it briefly, and let it out longer than you breathed in. You silently say, "This is a signal, not an order." You open the message. It's a question about something that can absolutely wait until Monday, even if part of you feels pressured to prove responsiveness. The old reaction nudges again. You imagine how annoyed you'll be if you don't respond. You imagine how it might look if you wait. That's when you remember the response buffer. You don't need to decide right now. You don't need to respond immediately to be responsible. You set the phone down for a moment and let yourself feel the discomfort. It's there, but it's not overwhelming. You say the microscript quietly in your head, "I can be responsible without being immediate." The intensity drops just a little. Enough to think clearly. You decide to respond, but on your terms. You type a short, neutral message, "I'm offline for the evening. I'll take a look Monday morning." You don't apologize. You don't explain. You send it, and then you put the phone face down on the table. There's a brief aftershock. Your mind wants to check if they reply. It wants reassurance that you didn't do something wrong. You notice that urge too. Instead of following it, you take another slow breath and say, "That moment is complete." You stand up, stretch your arms, and physically move into the kitchen. You're closing the loop, not just mentally but with your body. As you start cooking, another thought pops up. You replay the week. A tense meeting. A sharp comment you swallowed. A deadline that felt unfair. Normally, this is where your mind would spiral, stacking frustrations until the whole week feels heavy again. Tonight, you catch it early. You pause at the counter, take one breath, and say, "Those moments are complete." You're not denying they happened. You're choosing not to carry them into the weekend. Dinner tastes better than it usually does. Not because life is perfect, but because you're actually present. You notice your shoulders dropping. You notice that your thoughts are slower, less jagged. At some point, you realize you haven't checked your phone in a while, and that realization feels like relief instead of anxiety. Later that night, you feel a flicker of guilt. The old voice whispers that maybe you should have handled that message differently, that maybe you're being difficult. You recognize the voice. It's the one that over-explains, that personalizes pressure. You answer it calmly, "This is about the situation, not my value." You remind yourself that setting a boundary doesn't make you careless. It makes you sustainable. Before bed, you do one final thing. You jot down a short note about Monday, reply to Friday message. That's it. You've captured it. You say quietly, "I'll handle it tomorrow," and then you correct yourself, "I'll handle it Monday." You smile slightly at the distinction. Work has its place. Tonight isn't it? As you lie down, you notice something subtle but important. Your body feels tired, but not wired. Your mind isn't racing. You're not rehearsing conversations. You're not bracing for what's next. You're simply done for the day. That's new. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation. No grand declaration. Just a series of small, deliberate choices layered together. You paused instead of reacting. You didn't personalize the pressure. You used one sentence to set a boundary. You closed the emotional loop instead of dragging it forward. And because of that, one work message didn't steal your entire evening. This is what emotional control looks like under real pressure. Not perfection. Not indifference. Just enough space to choose. Enough structure to protect your energy. Enough awareness to keep one stressful moment from turning into a full emotional burnout spiral. You fall asleep knowing that Monday will come when it comes, and that when it does, you'll meet it with more capacity than you would have if you'd spent the weekend half working and half stressed. That's the quiet win. That's how burnout starts to loosen its grip. Section 10. What this entire episode has been about, at its core, is reclaiming agency in moments where burnout has quietly taken it away. Emotional burnout doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic breakdown. It arrives as a gradual loss of choice. You stop deciding how you respond and start reacting automatically. This lesson was about restoring that choice so your work no longer dictates your emotional state by default. First, we confronted the reality of burnout without moral judgment, naming it as a capacity problem rather than a personal failure. Then you learned how immediacy trains your nervous system to stay in constant alert, and how delaying responses creates space to think instead of panic. Next, we dismantled the habit of personalizing pressure, so urgency and poor communication stopped feeling like verdicts on your worth. After that, we addressed availability, replacing constant access with clear time boundaries that protect your ability to recover. Then we tackled over-explaining, showing how saying less preserves energy and keeps your limits intact. From there, you practiced mentally clocking out by capturing unfinished work instead of rehearsing it, allowing your mind to rest instead of staying on duty all night. You learned to recognize early warning signals in your body and treat them as information rather than commands. After that, you added emotional closure, deliberately ending stressful moments so they didn't bleed into the rest of your day. Finally, you watched all of those tools come together in that Friday night moment where one message didn't hijack your evening or your weekend. The thread tying all of this together is intentional response. Reacting feels fast and familiar, especially when you're exhausted. Responding feels slower, but it's steadier. And steadiness is what burnout quietly erodes. You don't recover from burnout by forcing calm or pretending things don't bother you. You recover by building small, reliable structures that prevent overload from accumulating in the first place. These tools aren't dramatic, but they're durable. They work precisely because they don't require willpower when you're already drained. It's important to say this clearly: emotional control does not mean emotional suppression. Nothing you practiced here involved numbing yourself, ignoring problems, or disengaging from responsibility. What you practiced was containment. You contained urgency. You contained pressure. You contained emotional carryover. That containment is what allows you to show up with consistency instead of swinging between overdrive and collapse. Now, here are 3 specific things to do today to lock this lesson into behavior, not just understanding. First, choose one communication channel that reliably spikes your stress and give yourself a defined response window for it today, even if that window is only 30 or 60 minutes. Second, write down one boundary sentence you will use the next time work reaches into your personal time, and commit to sending it once without apology or explanation. Third, at the end of today, write down tomorrow's single most important task, close your laptop or notebook, and say out loud that work is parked for the night. If this episode resonated, the natural next lesson to watch is one focused on dealing with guilt after setting boundaries, where we go deeper into why guilt shows up when you protect your energy and how to hold limits without backtracking or self-criticism. If you want a whole library of Stoic focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships, this is what we do here every week. If you feel messages like this need to reach more people, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.